discussing in particular this morning most recent concerns in the nation of Israel. And I want to just begin by stating something here. We often refer to Israel as being God's chosen people. And that's true. He chose Abraham to be the father of a nation. Abraham was a Gentile before he was a Jew, right? So it was God's purpose and plan to use Israel to bless the other nations. That's part of the Abrahamic covenant. We saw that last week. So yes, Israel is God's chosen nation, but that statement, that terminology confuses a lot of people. A chosen nation. But when we say they're His chosen people, I think it sometimes confuses people. Because the church is God's chosen people too. And Jewish people that are part of the church in this dispensation, I guess they got dual citizenship in a sense, right? The promises of the Abrahamic covenant were to the nation. The nation, as we're going to see, for all practical purposes, came to an end in AD 70. Came back as a nation in 1948. And the promises made to that nation, God's going to bring to fulfillment in the millennium and beyond through only believing Jewish people. But there will be a vast population of Gentile believers in that kingdom as well, who will also be blessed as a result of God's promises to Israel, which included the blessing of the Gentiles. So, I think it's good for us to kind of have that, because sometimes people hear the term, well, they're God's chosen people, like, well, we're nothing. That's not true. God so loved the world. He died for all of us. So let's get some historical perspective, and I'm going to fly through this because I'm guessing that you like to study history pretty much about the same level as most people like to study history, which is not. But history is important, and particularly so to our present discussion. We've given you the biblical background. It was last week, the Abrahamic covenant, the roots of the conflict between the Arabs and Israel. And now we need to kind of pick up and bring it to modern times. So, okay. Maybe the battery's dead. We'll do it this way. We'll try reloading this thing. Let's see how it happens. Well, this is really bad because I have no nose. Oh, there it is. Without this, I don't know what I'm doing either. Technology is not all we're working. Technology this morning seems to be against me, is all I can say. Let's look at a timeline starting back with the Abrahamic covenant. God gave the land of Israel to the descendants of Abraham approximately 4,000 years ago. That's just an important figure to keep in mind. The nation of Israel took possession of land in 1406 BC after their exodus from Egypt. They actually didn't possess the land until then. Abraham lived there, they resided there, and so on. But they weren't a nation at that point. Number 3, the Assyrians took the northern tribes of Israel captive in 722 BC, and they never returned. 10 tribes referred to as the lost tribes. The Assyrians would take all the important people out of a nation they conquered and move them elsewhere, so they would intermarry with other nations, and they would leave a representative number where they were at, their homeland, and then they would move other people in, so they would intermarry, and they destroyed nationalities that way. So there wouldn't be, revolts centering around You know, we're the people should be here and all that. Now, that doesn't mean they're lost to God, obviously, but they've not been a part of what's going on in Israel. They've lost their Jewish heritage. They only, you know, partly Jewish. They still exist, and in time, I think God's going to restore a lot of that in the prophetic future. The Babylonians took Judah captive in 586 BC, but they did return 70 years later under Nehemiah and Ezra, Zerubbabel, and so forth. And so they essentially became a nation again when they returned 70 years after the captivity. But they weren't exactly self-governing. This is really strange. Okay, there we go. Upon returning to the land of Israel, Judah existed as a vassal state under the domination of Persia to begin with. This is when Nehemiah, Ezra, and all of them came back. They had to pay tribute to Persia. They were the empire that kind of was the umbrella over them. And then Greece came along, Alexander the Great, and then after he died, it broke up into four segments under his four generals, and that domination continued down to the time when Rome became the predominant power, the empire, and even the times of Jesus, Israel was there, and they were still worshiping in the temple. They had a national government and all the rest, but they were still dominated by the Romans. A vassal state means that they are under the domination and protection militarily, they pay tribute, and they don't have entire freedom. They lost that national identity in AD 70, which is what Jesus talks about in Matthew 24, in the sense of looking forward. Of course, we know what happened in AD 70, a rebellion against, tried to throw off all the Roman rule, and I can't remember who the emperor was, but General Titus came in with the Roman legions and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, chased the remaining rebels to Masada, where they eventually all committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Romans. After that, Rome just ruled with an iron hand, and they kind of lost that aspect of self-government underneath of Rome. Now here's where things get interesting for present day. Afterwards, the Roman Emperor Hadrian, about 135 AD, renamed Judea and Galilee, and he incorporated them under the new name of Syria Palestina. Syria is a name that was used over the Galilean segments and then beyond the confines of Israel as well. And Judea became Palestine. Now, this happened after another revolt around 135 was put down by the Romans, because the Jews weren't operating nationally, but there was a lot of Jews still living in the land, and they kind of got together. There was another revolt. The Romans crushed that, and then Emperor Hadrian said, look, we're going to just Romanize everything. We're going to eradicate all aspects of Judaism, and they built a pagan temple where the Jewish temple was. They forbid Jewish worship, all the rest. And so the final eradication, which began here, took place 135, and Judea was renamed Palestine. Now, this is incredible, but Palestine, number 8, Palestine was the name the Greek writers gave to the land of the ancient Philistines, the ancient enemy of Israel. Goliath, the Philistines, go back to that day, the days of David. I haven't really found this as a historical fact, but some speculate that Hadrian decided he was going to rename the place after their arch enemies. There's another slap in their face, so to speak. Which button will work? Not that one. That one, okay. Now, that was AD 135. Palestine is just, the Roman Emperor just says, you're Palestine. You're not Judea. You're not Jewish anymore. You're a Roman province, period. That was 135 AD. Muhammad died in 632 AD, about 500 years later. He didn't live a long life, like about 30, 40 years, something like that. I can't remember exactly. But Islam had become a functioning religion by the time Muhammad died. 500 years after they became Palestine, but more importantly, 2,000 years after Israel possessed the land back in the 1400s BC. Who was there first? Okay. If you want to play that game, you see, from the present day political and historical background people have, the Palestinians have been there for years. Now the Jews come back and, and they took away their land. And you better go back a little further in history to get your facts straight on that. After the Roman Empire collapsed, Palestine was controlled by various Arab Islamic empires, the last being the Ottoman Empire. Now you can throw in the Crusaders, and some, they were back and forth and all, but mainly, for all those hundreds of years, Arab Islamic empires ruled over Palestine. The last was the Ottoman Empire. That is an Islamic empire based in Turkey. And they ruled for a long time. And they became an ally of Germany in World War I. So when Germany was defeated in World War I, they lost, all their lands and everything. And at that point, Palestine was placed under British control in 1920, later approved by the League of Nations in 1922. This was just all what the Allies imposed upon them. This placing it under British control was called the British Mandate. There were other countries, other Allied countries got other mandates, but the British Mandate, what they were in control of, included Palestine. It expired 1948 in May. And when that happened, Israel once again became a nation for the first time in over 1,800 years. Okay, I'm going to stop there with the historical aspect. There's been obviously wars and back and forth. I mean, as soon as Israel became a nation in 1948, the Arabs invaded. And they were just this little group of Jewish people that there were several thousand, obviously, but compared to the Arabs, this little small group, and they successfully defended themselves. That's an absolute miracle that could have happened. And it's been the same every year. I mean, every war, I should say. They've won. And there's 9 million people living in Israel. You're just dwarfed by the millions of Arabs around them that keeps attacking. So let's talk about the prophetic significance. Now turn to Ezekiel chapter 38. If you would, please. And we're going to jump from 1948 to the future, which is, we don't know when, the prophetic future, Ezekiel 38 to 39. And what we learned basically from Ezekiel 38 and 39 is that the conflict between Israel and the Arabs is never going to end until Jesus ends it when he comes back. It's always going to be there. Notice in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, after many days you will be summoned. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations. to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely, all of them. Now, that could not have been what we're going to read about in Ezekiel, this invasion, could not have taken place prior to 1948. We know that now. Obviously, back then, I mean, God's, the return of Jesus is imminent. God could have known, I mean, nobody knew when and if Israel was going to become a nation. But just looking at it historically, that's the case. But notice at the beginning, verse 8, after many days you will be summoned in the latter years, in times. You go down to verse 16, and it says, and you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It shall come about in the last days that I will bring you against my land. The latter days, the last days, prophetic future. I was speaking to a character called God. We'll get to him in just a second. This, in Ezekiel 38, describes a coming invasion of Israel by a northern confederacy, which will include several Arab nations. The leader of this confederacy we find beginning in verse 1. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog. So Gog seems to be the king, the dictator, whatever it may be in those days. The man in charge of the country, the one with the most sway. It's called Gog, and he is over a land called Magog. And he's further described as the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesying against them. Now, Magog has been identified by Bible scholars, prophetic experts, for years and years and years. I checked the book written by J. Dwight Pentecost back, I don't know, I had it in seminary in the 1980s, 1970s, I guess it was, and it was already in print then, and when he identified all this, and he goes back to Josephus and other historians, what do these names in our Bible, in the Hebrew, represent in those days? And they can be directly connected. I'm not going to try to explain all that to you because I probably do an extremely poor job. But we don't want to get bogged down there. Magog, specifically by Josephus, is identified as the people living in what is now the territory of Russia. Interestingly, Gog the leader, Magog the entire expanse of their whatever it is, country or empire, and then it mentions Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and those places have been identified as well as being far west in Russia and stretching down into northern Asia. They're just different areas or sections of Russia. Moving to verse 5. He mentions 5 more countries that will be aligned with Russia. Russia will be the perpetrator, the instigator, the head of all this invasion. Now some nations are mentioned as being aligned with Russia. The first one is Persia. Persia is Iran. Persia is, the ancient Persia occupied the land where Iran is today. They're Persian. Interestingly, Iran, going back to the Shah, was an ally of the United States until when? 1979, Islamic Revolution. Now they are not at all an ally of the United States. I think that's interesting prophetically. Ethiopia is the next one. Ethiopia is identified with an area of land south of Egypt, northeastern Africa, basically where modern day Ethiopia is. And then in verse 5, we also have this name put. And you see it translated put in the New American Standard. Some translations translate it Libya. But there is no certainty that it's in where modern day Libya is. It's probably more in another place, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then Gomer in verse 6 has been identified and is known to be the area of Germany. And finally, Beth Togarmah is ancient Turkey, or that ancient land is now Turkey. Another member of NATO and ally of the United States who is just backing away from NATO, the United States, and is just moving back away toward the whole group of Arab Islamic nations. So these are things you can see present day that's starting to line things up with the future prophecy.
Who is Cush?
I'm sorry, what?
Who is Cush? Like what area?
Cush?
Cush.
Uh,
Would that be the same as well? Would that be Ethiopia?
Some translations might use Cush.
Yeah, my notes said it was Ethiopia.
Cushites.
Mine says Persia, Cush, and Put.
What translation do you read?
New International.
Cush was the ancient land, like in the upper Nile, beneath, at the head of the Nile, right below where, ancient Egypt as we know it. Cush occupied that land.
Okay.
So I don't know, I think that probably is modern Ethiopia, I don't know, Sudan.
Sudan is in there, I'm not sure exactly if it's confines of modern day Ethiopia, but yeah, the Kushite Empire kind of preceded the Egyptian empires. And you'll find these variations in the English. So this is located on the map. We know where Germany is, we know where Russia is. Now the reason they're in green is because they're not Islamic. But the ones in blue are Islamic, Arabic. Turkey is almost 90+% Islamic. Iran, 98% Islamic. Ethiopia, modern day Ethiopia, Islamic, Libya. By the way, I got curious and I checked the percentage of the Russian population that is Islamic today. It's about 11%. That comes out to between 14 and 15 million people in Russia that are Islamic. You know what the population of Israel is? Less than that, 9 million. There is more Islamic people in Russia than there are Jews or Arabs or anybody else, the total population of Israel. By the way, I just put that there because it's so small. I couldn't find a star David, but. Okay, now we're going to talk about Libya for a minute. Some people think that Libya is the wrong modern day nation, that it should be a nation over here that was southeast of Iran or Persia, called Put. And that is why the New American Standard evidently translates it that way. So if we take this one out, it looks more like this. But it could be. There's no way to be certain about all this. Just telling you what I found. Now, look where Put is at. They take away the rest. Just give you a bigger, a smaller area on the map, bigger, what do you call that? Zoomed in, I zoomed in, okay. And Put, here's Iran, Put's down here. What do you find? Yemen. An Islamic group called the Houthi rebels took over Yemen a few years ago. They are aligned with guess who? Iran. They don't get along with Saudi Arabia. So keep that in mind. Let's go back to our prophetic implications. The invasion that's going to come, as it is outlined in Ezekiel 38, will occur at a time called the latter years, the latter days. I've already got ahead of myself and mentioned that, so let's go to number 4. The invasion will come at a time when Israel is dwelling securely in the land. So let's go back to verse 11 if you got your Bibles open. The prophet speaking as if he's speaking to Gog. And you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. Well, an unwalled village, from an ancient perspective, is you don't need walls, right? You're also going to build them for defensive purposes. Go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest. This is what Gog is planning. They're at peace. They're at rest. And live securely, all of them. Living without walls. Having no bars or gates. I'm going to go over to verse 14. Again, Ezekiel says, therefore prophesy, son of man, and say to Gog, or the Lord speaking to Ezekiel, the son of man, say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day when my people Israel are living securely, will you not know it? And then he goes on to talk about the invasion. Prophetically, the only time I know of that we can be sure of that that will be the case is during the first half of the tribulation. The Antichrist will confirm that covenant with many, Daniel, prophecy of the 70 years. He'll confirm that last 7 years with Israel. Make a covenant with them. The Antichrist and the 10-nation confederacy at the beginning will guarantee the peace and safety of Israel. All the persecution and war against Israel in the second half of the tribulation is the campaign leading up to Armageddon. So let's take a look at our chart. Oh, I think my pointer maybe is working. I'm not using it, thinking it wasn't working. It is working. So here's the rapture of the church, the first 3.5 years, the second 3.5 years. There are two views as to when this battle in Ezekiel 38 will take place. Among dispensationalists, among pre-tribulational, premillennial groups of people. Some think it will happen prior to the rapture. I'm not saying it can't. I'm just saying it would have to be a time when they're dwelling in the land safely. We don't see that today. So, I mean, could it happen? And then could they go back into conflict again? I mean, anything like that's possible. But I think the most probable thing is that it doesn't happen prior to the rapture, but after, when we enter into this first 3.5 years, when the Antichrist and all the nations supporting him guarantee the peace and the safety of Israel. The Antichrist is a hero at that point. He solved the Arab-Israeli problem. He's brought peace through power, political alignment. By the way, the rider on the first horse, Revelation chapter 6, he's on a horse with a bow, doesn't say a word about arrows. He conquers peaceably at that early stage. That's the Antichrist. So, I think this is the most probable time. Russia, Iran, Turkey, Germany, the others, you see an unprotected land. They're not militarily engaged, they're safe. And if you read carefully of Ezekiel, they come for spoil. I think they come to take the resources. They see Israel as an easy target at this point. And no doubt that's Russia, maybe Germany. By the way, we don't know how Germany fits all back into this. But more and more, all the nations of the world have a higher and higher percentage of Islamic population. I said it was about 11% in Russia. It's about 5% in America. And you take 5% of America's population and compare it to 10 or 11% of Russia's population, there's more Islamic people in America than there is in Russia. And Germany, I think it's 5% or so. The Islamic people have spread out through the whole world. So, Russia is probably looking at financial gain, resources, whatever, but they could be overly influenced by that 10% Islamic people that's within the confines of their country too. The other Islamic countries, Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, so they're probably more motivated, it's probably not that they were not at all motivated by the resources and the profit of the whole thing, but no doubt their motivation goes back to the historical hatred of Israel by the Arabs. I've read this, and I think it makes sense. If this invasion occurs here, it's going to be put down by God, not the Antichrist. You read Ezekiel 38 carefully. I don't know if we have time to really get into it. The northern invaders are all wiped out. Look what God does to them. I'm not seeing the verse.
Verse 22.
Okay, let's go down to verse 20. The fish of the sea, the birds of the heaven, the beasts of the field, all the creeping things that creep on earth, and so on, all the people will shake at my presence. The mountains will be thrown down. The steep pathways will collapse. Every wall will fail. Every wall will fall to the ground. I will call for a sword against him on all my mountains, declares the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother. With pestilence and with blood I will enter into judgment. God is going to bring this back. He mentions a torrential rain of hailstones in verse 22 and fire and brimstone. Now, whether God does this directly or some other way, God is the one who does it. He wipes out the northern invaders. But now, probably, the Antichrist has, I think it's time for me to take a little bit more control in Israel. I don't want this happening again. He moves in, and then it all dovetails with everything Satan's doing. He comes in, he declares himself to be God, he sets up himself in the temple of God, and he begins to persecute Jewish believers, and they're chased out and to the hiding place in the wilderness, and they're persecuted for that last 3.5. And he becomes the power and the presence militarily for the first time in Israel. That leads then to the whole campaign leading up to Armageddon, which will involve the king of the east, the king of the south, and then that whole last battle of Armageddon. Some interpreters think this and this are all one and the same, and this should even be over here. That's another interpretation. I'm going to run into several of these. All right. Prophetic implications continue. The invasion will occur at a time called the latter days. The invasion will come at a time when Israel is dwelling securely in the land. Prophetically, this fits the first half. And then the invaders will be destroyed. Like convulsions of nature, it seems, is the description, but it could be more than that. That's what we just looked at. Now let's move on to the seventh prophetic implications. The prophetic significance of current events evolves around Iran more than anybody else right now. We're coming up time-wise now to the whole Hamas invasion, the day in which we live, this present moment. The prophetic significance that I think is the greatest here is Iran's at the center of all that's going on. And Iran, in the end times, will be right there with Russia when this northern invasion comes. Iran is providing military support for Hamas in Gaza. Iran has a religious and military connection with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, Iran, Shia Muslim, Hamas, Sunni Muslims. Most Muslims are Sunni, 90% or more. The militant Iranian Shia Muslims. This split, kind of into two denominations, goes back to the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, involving who was the rightful, leader, the next leader, and they kind of had a split. They don't get along. This is why Iran and Iraq had a war a number of years ago, partly because of two different factions of Islam. But now Iran is getting along even with Sunnis. Iraqi, Sunni, Iran, Shia. That war occurred before we got into it over there in the early 90s. Hamas came out of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They're Sunnis. But now Iran is giving them military support. Why? Because they have a common enemy, Israel. With Hezbollah, though, Hezbollah is like Iran. They are Shia, so they have a religious and a military connection. The Houthi rebels in Yemen also are Shia. They have a religious and military connection as well. And interesting enough, Iran is even providing military support for Russia in the Ukraine. The Iranian drones that are being used, and who knows what else. We've all read about that. Iran's got their hands everywhere. Eventually, Russia, it seems incredible that Russia is going to be much of an international power, considering the debacle they have experienced trying to defeat the Ukraine. But remember, they are a nuclear power. So eventually, they'll call the shots, but they're right there with Iran. Now let's put this on the map. Here's Iran. They have a direct connection to Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels. And then the Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels, they all have that Shia Muslim connection, as well as a military connection, terroristic philosophy, the whole jihad, and all the rest. But they also have a connection with Hamas, Sunnis, and they also have a military connection with Russia up here to Ukraine. But right now, everything that Iran is doing, by the way, the Houthi, this is the group that sent the drones to attack the U.S. ship just a week or so ago. The U.S. ship was up here in the Red Sea, and they sent the drones, and the U.S. ship kept shooting the drones down. They never inflicted any damage. I did think they did do some damage on some merchant ships, but not the destroyer. I can't remember the name of the destroyer, but we got a destroyer here that was attacked by. Why? Well, look at the connections. Why? Their stated purpose was, we're going to not let any commerce go through here that has anything to do with helping Israel. Just looking at that says, here's a flashing light. Here's a billboard alongside the road, Iran, Iran, Iran. Now, does that mean the rapture is going to occur tomorrow? We don't know. Is it going to occur 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now? I don't know. That's God's business. And a lot of things that looks like it might be lining up prophetically can look so good, and then it can go the other way and come back. I'll give you Russia, for example. All this about Russia and the northern invasion was talked about by Bible prophecy scholars and back before Ronald Reagan and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I remember back at that time thinking, wow, Russia's supposed to be the one that's instigating this this big invasion prophetically, and Russia just kind of didn't. But carry it forward. They still have their nuclear bombs, their missiles, and all the rest. And then arises Putin, who's connected back to USSR, it's just now called Russia. Nothing really has changed. But things like that happen, and current events sometimes make you wonder, well, you know, we can't pinpoint dates and times and moments, or even years. But I think it's reasonable to say, more than any other time in history, we can see happening before our eyes something that is described in the Bible, going back to Ezekiel. So that does produce a lot of excitement. Now there's a lot of people that like to get on the internet and they got all their theories and their ideas, and be careful getting zeroed in on one person's opinion of everything. Try to stay with, this is what we know. A lot of people, it's just an exciting subject, and sometimes I wonder if certain people get on the internet and they want to teach things that, you know, just get them more subscribers, you know, it's exciting. So just be careful of that. But we do know that's an exciting thing to see unfolding.
You may not know the answer, but do we know what which faction of Muslims are in Turkey? Are they Sunni or?
They're pretty much Sunni, I think. I'm just going to remember, I could be wrong. But this is interesting to me, how the Sunni and the Shia are coming together when it comes to Israel right there. You know what I'm saying? They'll put their religion aside when it comes to Israel. And Turkey is in this group, going to come with Russia. Turkey, Germany, Russia. And Israel's going to be surrounded. Again, remember, there are more Islamic people in Russia today than there is the entire population of Israel. That's how absolutely this could possibly, you know, all snowball. Whether that's the case or not, we don't know, but we do know that Israel's this little speck of 9 billion people in this little strip of land that by all human understanding shouldn't be there. Even if they became a nation in 1948, nobody would have guessed they would have endured all they've endured in their still. God, when he brought Israel back in 1948, that's another big flashing billboard. It's now just coming to another step closer. I think that's all I got. But I wanted to leave some time for a little discussion, and we got a little bit of time. So maybe you know something that maybe I've missed, you need to throw into this, or you have a question or whatever. I think that's all.
So, does America get brought into the hate because of our Judeo-Christian leanings, background, our friendship with Israel? Is that one part of this?
Our Judeo-Christian heritage certainly played into all of our support. England was in favor of giving the land to the Jewish people. They recognized it, going clear back to the end of World War I, it was recognized by Britain and America and a lot of other nations that it was Israel's land. But today, it's not seen that way by very many people. And unfortunately, America is now pressuring Israel, back off, don't go too far. So, religiously, I mean, among Christians, there's a lot of Christians who are anti-Semitic because they don't A lot of people just look at the fact Palestine from 135 to 1948, and then Israel comes in and takes over. That isn't fair. If they don't understand, Israel was there since. And another thing they don't understand is the Abrahamic covenant and the promises to Israel. Amillennialism and the whole theological thing that's permeated the church has equated what? The church with Israel. So Israel as a nation just, and people that want to, even people that want to be on the right side and defend the innocent, don't have no any better side with us.
I think what I'm saying too is, I see where you're saying that this big war from the north will come probably in that first, or this, right at the end of the first 3 years of the tribulation. But it's like you see the world stage setting for it, even, and no country will come to Israel's defense at that time. No country. And it's hard right now to think of us not going to their defense, but yet even politically you see that happening. Though our president is initially standing up for Israel, he's backing down at the same time. And I think that, when you look at like even things like the whole, when we got rid of our, whatever they call that with Iran, and then Biden reinstated it, so they've become so rich now, able to do the things they're doing. And we see all of it. I think you can see it happening. It may not happen before or after the tribulation, before or after the rapture. It's obvious to me that the world is setting the stage. I don't see how anyone can not see how it's setting the stage. I just see it clearly, although you say we don't know the time.
But being able to see it depends on what you understand.
True, because I have a nephew every day who talks about this.
A lot of these people are just fed.
Right, he has no faith, he doesn't believe in God, so he doesn't believe any of this. Right.
Jay, looking at your map there, you look at the mass, the massive land mass of the Islamic world, and they want to chop up Israel. From that perspective, it's just crazy.
And one thing your question evokes is, what about the United States prophecy? It's not there. Now, I know there's some Bible teachers who do a lot of mental and theological gymnastics to try to find it. There's just nothing there in Scripture. So what does that mean? Well, it could well mean that the United States is allied with the Antichrist and that 10-nation confederacy that guarantees the peace of Israel. And that's why they're not here. Not a good place for us to be, but it might be that. Others have speculated the rapture will remove so many Christians from America and we'll become a third world power. Well, we might become a third world power for a lot of reasons.
We already see that happening.
So this is primarily Muslim, Judeo, where we hopefully the Christians.
Israel-Arab conflict, but the Arabs have effectively all become Muslims, so it's fair to say Islamic or Israel conflict. But the conflict was there before Islam.
I understand that, but you can't disregard China, India. You're talking another 6 billion people with nuclear capabilities and everything else. So, from a prophetic Old Testament, does the Bible address China? It's literally talking about the enemies of Israel, which basically comes down to a Muslim versus a Jewish conflict, just like you said. But there's forces outside of that.
Exactly. And this all occurring in the first half of the tribulation. A lot of this is going to be Arab hatred of Israel. God squashes them. If the Antichrist, well, we know, for whatever reason, we know the Antichrist is going to come in and set himself up as a god. Abomination, desolation, take over the temple, begin to persecute the Jews and occupy their land. Probably after this. And then in Revelation 16, talks about the Euphrates River being dried up as one of the trumpets, or I'm not sure which one of the judgments. The Euphrates River is dried up, which is one natural barrier. This is dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. That would include probably China, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, you know. And that's a 200 million man army, noted in the book of Revelation. So China isn't particularly mentioned as a nation, but you can't help but believe they're the major power in the east. So if America's aligned with the Antichrist, they're going to be coming to that battle of Armageddon is going to be that country. Not specifically named, but yeah, by the time it's all over, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got all of the Asian countries, you've got the European countries under the Antichrist, you've got the African countries, and the whole world's going to be. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but it says in Ezekiel, one of the verses in there, and all of you, Russia, Iran, and so on, but it says, and the many other nations with it, which are not named. That's also mentioned. There's even more. It's not mentioned. So going back to what you're stating, I think you're right. It's going to be an Arab, Islamic, Israeli conflict, Northern Confederation. But that's going to kind of dissipate in some regards because they're basically all defeated, and then it becomes the Antichrist and the rest of the world, and whatever remnants of that. Almost time to go to service. But anybody else have something quick? You just can't wait. You gotta have it. You gotta talk about it.
Come, Lord Jesus.